morning was gray and still. When Nora Callum set her seed bag on the courthouse steps, she did not rush. She did not look at the men in the suits who had arrived earlier, who had already taken their seats near the front of the room, who had already arranged their papers in neat, confident stacks. She set her bag down the way a person sets down something heavy they have been carrying a long time. Slowly, deliberately, like it was the last time she intended to carry it alone. The room was a county agricultural review chamber. Not a courtroom, exactly, but close enough. There was a long table at the front, 3 chairs behind it for the board members who would hear the matter. There were rows of wooden seats, most of them filled with other farmers, county agents, a few reporters from the local weekly, and 2 men from Caldwell Ag Solutions, the regional agricultural investment firm that had been buying up parcels of land across Mercer County for the better part of 4 years. Those men wore clean boots, the kind that had never touched wet earth. Nora sat in the 3rd row. She wore her good coat, the brown wool one her mother had left behind, and she carried a canvas satchel that was soft with age and dark at the corners from years of handling. She placed it on her lap and kept both hands on top of it. Her face was calm. To anyone watching, she looked like someone waiting for a bus. The man at the center of the front table was Dale Pruitt, the county's head of agricultural land classification. He was efficient, the way bureaucrats become efficient after decades of processing small disputes into manageable paper trails. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked at the file in front of him. He cleared his throat. He said that this was a matter regarding land parcel designation for the Callum homestead, approximately 94 acres on the western edge of Mercer County, currently classified as marginal dry soil farmland, unfit for commercial crop production. He said the matter had been reviewed twice before and that the board's previous position remained unchanged. He said this, as though it were already over. Clayton Hale was sitting to the left, at the smaller table reserved for interested parties. He was the lead acquisitions director for Caldwell Ag Solutions. He was not a large man, but he had the posture of someone accustomed to rooms agreeing with him. He had a yellow legal pad on the table before him, a pen in his hand, and the quiet, composed expression of someone who has already calculated the outcome. He had offered Nora $42,000 for her land the previous autumn. She had not returned his calls. He had raised the offer to $58,000 in February. She had sent back a single handwritten note that said only, "Not for sale." End quote. He had come today expecting the board to reclassify the land as unproductive, which would trigger a county tax reassessment that would, in practical terms, make the property impossible for a single woman with no commercial income to hold. Pruitt asked if the claimant had anything to present before the board issued its final designation. He asked it the way people ask questions they do not expect to receive answers to. He was already reaching for his stamp. Nora stood. She reached into the canvas satchel. She removed a folded piece of cloth. It was tied at the top with a length of garden twine. She set it on the table in front of Pruitt without untying it. She said she had something to show the board, but that she would need a few minutes to explain where it came from. Pruitt looked at the cloth. He looked at Clayton Hale. He looked back at his watch. He said she had 10 minutes. She said 10 minutes would be enough. She had not always been so certain. 6 months earlier, standing in the middle of her father's fields in July, with the dust rising off the earth in thin, pale curtains, and the corn standing chest-high and dense and green in rows that ran straight as fence wire from the road all the way to the far tree line, she had almost doubted. Not the corn. The corn she had never doubted. It was the paper trail she was not sure about. She had believed her father's word. She had believed the notebooks he left behind. But belief and proof are different things, and she had known that. By the time this day came, she would need both. Her father was Elias Callum. He had died 3 winters before, leaving Nora, the land, the house, 2 decent tractors, one of which ran reliably, and 12 spiral-bound notebooks he had kept over 30 years of farming. The notebooks were not diaries exactly. They were records. Soil composition, readings taken by hand, season by season, pH levels measured with a kit he ordered from a seed catalog, water table observations marked in the margin, with a date and a depth measurement in pencil. Rainfall totals. Root depth estimates, yield counts by the bushel, written in columns so precise they looked like the work of an accountant. Elias Callum had grown up hearing that the western edge of Mercer County was no good for row crops. Everyone said so. The soil had too much sand in it, too little clay, too little water retention. The county had said so. The extension office had said so. The neighbors had said so over fences, and at grain co-ops, and at the feed store. In town, the western fields were good for grazing, maybe good for hay in a wet year. But corn? Soybeans? Wheat? People had tried and failed for generations. The land had a reputation. Reputations stick. But Elias had a theory. He had watched the soil for years the way a doctor watches a patient. He noticed that the drainage patterns on his property ran differently than on the neighboring parcels. He noticed that the subsurface layer, about 14 inches down, was not pure sand but a mixed composition that held moisture longer than anyone realized. He noticed that certain areas of the field, the areas everyone else had given up on first, stayed damp 2 days after a rain, while the surrounding county land had already dried and cracked. He did not announce this theory. Where? He did not write letters to the extension office. He just started experimenting, quietly, the way a man who distrusts applause begins a long project. He began amending the soil in the spring of 1991. Little composted matter here, a measured amount of clay-heavy subsoil turned in from the low section near the creek. He adjusted the drainage furrows by hand, a full afternoon of work every spring, so that rainfall moved through the field more slowly, spending more time in the root zone before running off. He planted a variety of corn developed for sandy loam conditions, a variety he had read about in a university agricultural bulletin he'd found at a library sale, the pages already yellowing at the edges. He told no one. He said he was just keeping busy. The first harvest in 1992 was modest. The second, in '93, was better. By 1997, the yield from his west fields was comparable to the county average for prime farmland. He noted this in his notebook. On a Tuesday in October, without celebration, in the same even handwriting he used for everything else, as though the fields had simply confirmed what he already knew. Because for him, they had. The neighbors still called it sand. They said he was getting lucky. They said it wouldn't last. Some of them said he must be running irrigation in secret, which he was not. And the county classification office had assessed the land once in 1986, declared it marginal, and had not reassessed it since. The classification had never changed on paper, even as the yields continued to climb. Elias had not pressed the issue. He was a man who measured everything and contested nothing. He believed eventually the land would speak for itself. He had told Nora this many times. They would be out in the field in the early evening, the light going amber over the rows, and he would stop and pick up a handful of soil and let it fall through his fingers. And he would say, "The land does not argue, it just grows." She had listened without fully understanding. She was young, and she wanted faster things. She had left for 2 years to study at an agricultural college downstate. She had come back when he got sick, and she had stayed. He died on a February morning quietly, in the farmhouse, with the land gray and frozen outside, and the notebooks stacked on the kitchen table where he had been reviewing them the night before. She had found him in his chair, the most recent notebook open in his lap, a pencil on the floor where it had fallen. She had picked up the pencil before she had done anything else. She did not know why. She had kept it in the satchel ever since. In the spring after his death, Nora had planted corn in the west fields exactly as her father had done, not because she needed to prove anything then, because it was what he would have done, and she did not know what else to do with grief except continue the work. The corn grew. It grew the way it had always grown under his care, which is to say it grew well, quietly, without calling attention to itself, which was its own kind of testimony. She had not known about Caldwell Ag Solutions until the first letter arrived in May, 2 years after Elias died. The letter was polite. It described the firm's interest in consolidating parcels in Mercer County for regional agricultural development. It offered a number that looked large until she divided it by the acreage, and realized it was roughly half what viable farmland in the county was selling for per acre. She did not respond. A second letter came in August with a higher number. A third came in November. By December, she had learned enough about Caldwell to understand what they were doing. They were buying marginal land at low prices, reclassifying it through county contacts, improving it at scale using commercial inputs and equipment, and then either farming it under contract arrangements or selling it again at 3 times what they had paid. They were not farmers, they were land processors. And they had decided her land was next. She had gone back to the notebooks then, with a different kind of attention. She had read every entry her father had made. She had found the soil composition records, she had found the yield logs, she had found something else too. Near the back of the 7th notebook, folded into the inside cover, she had found a letter. It was addressed to her father from the office of the county agricultural assessor. It was dated the spring of 2003. It acknowledged receipt of Elias Callum's formal soil amendment documentation and stated that the county had reviewed his submitted data, including 3 years of yield records and independent soil samples, and was in the process of initiating a reclassification review for the western parcels of the Callum property. The letter was signed by the assessor at the time, a man named Gerald Fortis, who had died in 2007, 3 years before Nora came home. The review had never been completed. The reclassification had never been issued. The records had been filed and then forgotten, the way records get forgotten when the person who knew about them is no longer there to follow up. The classification from 1986 had simply remained. Elias had apparently never pushed the matter further. Either he had trusted the process or, more likely, he had decided the land would outlast the paperwork. He had been right about the land. The paperwork was another matter. What? Nora had spent 4 months before this hearing working through county records. She had filed a public records request for the original Callum soil assessment documentation from 2003. She had requested the assessor's correspondence files from that period. She had hired no lawyer. She could not afford one. She had read everything herself, slowly with her father's pencil behind her ear, the way he used to keep it when he was concentrating. She had found the file. It had not been destroyed or hidden. It had simply been misfiled, placed in a general correspondence folder rather than in the active reclassification case folder, and never cross-referenced. The data her father had submitted was still there. 3 years of hand-recorded yield figures, 2 independent soil composition analyses from a state university extension program, which her father had quietly commissioned and paid for himself in 2001 and 2002, a written summary of his soil amendment methods, drafted in his careful handwriting on ruled paper. All of it present, all of it unexamined for more than 20 years. And there was something else. When she had looked more carefully at the yield data her father had submitted alongside those university soil analyses, she had noticed that the west fields of the Callum property were producing numbers that did not match the sandy, marginal classification on record. Not even close. The university's own analysis had noted in plain language that the subsurface composition showed characteristics consistent with amendable productive farmland given appropriate management practices. The report had been submitted to the county. The county had filed it and forgotten it. She stood before the board and she explained this. She did not raise her voice. She laid the documents on the table one at a time. The original letter from Gerald Fortis in 2003, the university soil analysis from 2001, the yield records her father had submitted. Her own yield records from the previous 3 seasons, notarized by a local grain elevator operator who had received and weighed the harvests himself. She placed them in a line left to right in the order in which they had been created, the way her father might have laid out evidence. Clayton Hale spoke first. He said the records were historical in nature and did not reflect current soil conditions. He said the county's existing classification was the operative standard and that documents submitted more than 2 decades ago by a private individual without professional certification carried no formal weight in a reclassification proceeding. He said this efficiently without looking at Nora. Pruitt adjusted his glasses. He appeared less certain than he had 10 minutes before. He asked the board's recording secretary if there was a file on the 2003 review. There was a pause. The secretary said she would have to check. Hale said it was irrelevant because any previous review process would have been superseded by subsequent assessments. He said this smoothly, as though it were settled law. Nora reached into the satchel. She removed a second document. This one was a copy of the county's own agricultural reclassification procedures, the version current in 2003, the same version that had been in effect when Gerald Fortis had written his letter. She placed it in front of Pruitt. She pointed to a single paragraph near the bottom of the second page. The paragraph stated that once a formal soil amendment submission had been received and acknowledged by the county assessor, the reclassification review process was legally initiated and could only be closed by a formal written determination, either confirming or denying the reclassification, issued to the submitting party. No such determination had ever been issued to Elias Callum. Not in 2003, not after, not ever. The review had been initiated. It had never been closed. Pruitt read the paragraph twice. He removed his glasses. He set them on the table. The room, which had been making the soft, restless sounds of people waiting for something routine, had gone quiet. Hale said the procedural clause was administrative in nature and carried no substantive force over a current land use dispute. Nora said plainly that it meant the reclassification review her father had initiated was still technically open, that the county had never formally denied his petition, that the soil data he had submitted had never been formally reviewed or rejected by any authorized body. She said this without heat. She said it the way her father might have read a column of numbers aloud, evenly, accurately. Hale leaned forward. He said to Pruitt that the county had latitude to treat expired procedural matters as administratively closed by default. He said if there was any ambiguity in the record, the board could simply issue a clean denial today, and the matter would be resolved. He was still confident, but he was working harder at it now. Pruitt said he was not prepared to issue a determination under those conditions without consulting the county attorney. Hale paused. He recalculated. He turned to look at Nora for the first time since she had stood up. His expression was the expression of someone who has walked into a room expecting a certain kind of conversation and found a different kind entirely. He said that Caldwell Ag Solutions was prepared to increase its acquisition offer to $75,000 and that such a settlement would make the entire procedural question moot. Nora looked at him. She looked at him the way her father used to look at the soil after a long, dry spell, patiently, without expectation, but without any yielding either. She said the land was not for sale. She had already said this. She said it again because it was still true. The recorder returned to the room with a folder. She placed it in front of Pruitt. Inside was the original case file from 2003, the submitted documents, the university analyses. The initiating letter, signed by Gerald Fortis. It had been there all along in a filing cabinet, one hallway over, in a drawer labeled Pending Agricultural Reviews, a drawer that had apparently not been opened in 15 years. The board called a recess. When they returned, Pruitt's posture was different. He said the board had determined that the 2003 review process constituted an unresolved proceeding, and that in accordance with county procedure, the board would be formally reopening the Callum land classification case for full review. He said the review would include the historical submission data as well as current yield documentation. He said the current reclassification request would be suspended pending that review. He said it carefully, in the measured tone of an official aware that a mistake of institutional neglect has just been named in public. Hale said nothing for a long moment. Then he said his clients would be in touch. He gathered his yellow legal pad on which he had written very little, and he left. The witnesses in the room were quiet, in the way people get quiet when they have watched something unfold that they did not expect and are not yet sure how to describe, not celebratory, attentive. Several of the farmers in the back rows had stopped checking their phones. An older man near the window, a neighbor of Nora's, whom she had known since she was small, turned and looked at her with the particular expression of someone revising a long-held opinion. He did not say anything. He nodded once. Nora gathered her documents. She placed them back in the canvas satchel in the same order she had removed them. She picked up the folded cloth from the table, the one she had placed before Pruitt at the start and which he had never asked her to open. She put it in the satchel as well. No one had asked what was inside it. It was a good thing. It was simply a handful of soil from the West Field, dark, cohesive, the texture of something that had been carefully built over decades. Her father would have called it proof enough. She had brought it because he would have brought it. She put it away and walked outside. The air was cooler than it had been when she had arrived. There was the smell that comes before rain, that clean electric weight that settles over dry ground and makes the dust feel suddenly provisional. She stood on the steps for a moment and looked out at the street. The trees along the courthouse block were full and green. Somewhere out on the county road a truck was moving west. She knew, without looking, which direction the fields were. She drove home without stopping. She parked where she always parked, at the edge of the lane where the gravel gives way to packed earth. She walked to the west field. The corn was tall and close. It stood in its rows with the same quiet density it always had, indifferent to what had happened in town, occupied entirely with the business of growing. She walked along the edge of the first row, with her hand brushing the leaves, feeling the rough, reliable texture of each one. The light was going down, now going gold over the tops of the stalks, and the fields smelled of green growth and warm earth and the first faint dampness of the coming rain. She stopped at the place where the row ended, and the open ground began. She reached down and pressed both palms flat against the soil. It was warm from the day sun. Under that warmth, just slightly, was the cool moisture of the layer beneath. The layer her father had found, the layer everyone else had missed. She stayed like that for a long time. Not in triumph, not in relief, exactly. In something quieter and more complete than either of those things. The land had not changed. The land had never needed to be vindicated. It had been producing all along, year after year, speaking its own language in bushels and root depth and moisture retention and the particular color of its corn in August. It had been patient. It had been right. It had simply needed someone willing to carry the notebooks far enough. Her father had started the work. She had finished the carrying. The fields would do the rest, the same way they had always done it, the same way they would keep doing it. Season by season, row by row, long after the paperwork was settled and the lawyers had moved on to other things. That was the nature of land. It did not negotiate. It did not file motions. It grew, or it did not grow, and the truth of it was in the yield. She stood up and walked back toward the farmhouse. The first drops of rain came before she reached the door. Small and slow, landing in the dust with the soft sound of an old promise being kept. The world had laughed once, laughed at the idea of corn in sand, laughed at a woman who would rather carry an old satchel to a county hearing than take a fair check and be done with it. The world had not understood that some things are not about the money. So, they are about the record, about the notebook, about the letter. A dead man wrote to a county office that never wrote back. About a daughter who read every page and walked every row and waited for the morning when patience would finally be more powerful than certainty. The reclassification review would take 3 months. When it concluded, the west fields of the Callum homestead would be formally designated as productive Class II farmland. The reassessment would reduce Nora's property tax burden and confirm a market value for the land that was nearly 3 times what Caldwell Ag Solutions had offered. She would not sell. She would plant again in the spring. Clayton Hale would move on to other parcels, other counties, other offers. The kind of man he was did not stop. But he would not return to the Callum land, and everyone in Mercer County who had watched the hearing would remember why. Some victories arrive quietly. They do not announce themselves. They come in the form of a reclassification notice delivered in a plain envelope on an ordinary morning, or in the particular color of a field in late summer, or in the sound of rain on a farmhouse roof after a long dry stretch. They come after patience, not instead of it. And they belong not only to the person standing at the end, but to every hand that worked the ground before them. The pencil stayed in the satchel. It would stay there for the rest of Nora Callum's life. Some things you carry, not because they are useful, but because they are true. Now, not far from the edge of a different county, in a different state, there is a woman who received a letter last month. The letter came from a law office she had never heard of, regarding a water easement she had never been told about. An easement her grandfather signed in 1957, an easement that runs across land a development company has been quietly acquiring for 3 years. The company believes the easement expired. The woman found her grandfather's copy of the original agreement in a tin box beneath a floorboard in the barn. The agreement says something different. Next time we follow her to the door of that law office, canvas satchel in hand, documents in order, ready to show them what an old promise still looks like when someone has been careful enough to keep it.